Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. As you know, in 1995, the General Assembly established by law that the Connecticut Freedom Trail should exist. In 1995, August to be exact, it opened in about 60 towns with about 30 sites. And then a year later, it officially opened in September 1996, making September Connecticut Freedom Trail Month. Today, we're going to have a special guest, Dr. Raymond A. Winbush, and he's going to be talking about reparations for the descendants of enslaved. But before we get to that, a little housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat on whatever social media platform you are watching from, and we will make sure to get to them. Any questions or comments? Today, we're going to welcome Raymond A. Winbush. He's the director of the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University. He earned both his MA and PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago and has taught at Oakwood, Alabama, A&M, Vanderbilt, and Fisk universities. He is the author of numerous articles and has published 4 books, including Belinda's Petition, A Concise History of Reparations for the Transatlantic Slave Trade. He was also the senior researcher on the Academy Award-winning film Judas and the Black Messiah, which was produced by Ryan Coogler and has appeared on numerous TV shows discussing racism. A former board member of the National Council for Black Studies, he currently sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Black Studies. Welcome, Dr. Ray Winbush, my friend. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you as well, Tammy. We got to do this in person sometime.
Yes, we do.
Let me know when you're in Baltimore or when I'm up in Connecticut. I'll let you know.
Yes, definitely.
So you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can do this. Okay. So I'm going to try to, in 20, well, maybe 30 minutes, to try to discuss what has been going on for the past 400 or 583 years with regards to Africans in America as well as on the continent. I bring you greetings from Morgan State University, HBCU. If you like football, we gave the world Leroy Kelly, the running back for the Cleveland Browns, my hometown. If you like politics, we gave the world Kwesi Mfume, the representative in the House for Baltimore. If you like business, we gave the world Earl Graves, the founder and editor of Black Enterprise magazine. But our greatest gift was a sister that graduated there in 1918 from Morgan's High School by the name of Zora Neale Hurston. All of you should read Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's one of the greatest books. So I'm deeply immersed in HBCU life. Morgan is my 4th one. My 2 children graduated from them, and I'm just glad to be here. So let's start right now. You see before you a map of the transatlantic slave trade, and this is only a map up until about 1775. There were millions of Africans stolen from the continent. And we tend to, the numbers always get, exaggerated downward. For example, the late historian John Henry Clark said that when somebody asked him how many Africans were stolen out of the continent, he said, we must begin the count at 60 million. My teacher at the University of Chicago, John Hope Franklin, said it was probably between 60 and 80 million. And W.B. Du Bois, who had some issues with people classified as white, said there may have been as high as 100 million. But it is, you look at figures nowadays, and I've seen figures like 12 million and so forth, as if the records that were kept represent all the Africans that were stolen. In fact, probably 2/3 of the transatlantic slave trade was illegal and never had any records kept about it. So let's begin. This is one of my favorite quotes about enslavement in this country by the late Ralph Wiley. He said, give me the free labor of one Black person for 1 year, I would be a rich man. Give me the free labor of a dozen black people for 12 years, I would be a very rich man. Give me the free labor of millions of black people for 250 years, I would be America. You know, among black folk, we're fond of saying a lot of time, we built this country. And we say that kind of rhetorically. But if you do the research, you'll find out that that statement is absolutely true. Edward Baptiste, in his book, The Half Has Not Been Told, said that prior to the American Civil War, that 54% of the gross national product in this country had to do with enslavement, not textiles, although it was connected to enslavement by the cotton industry, but 54% of the GNP of this country was wrapped up in enslavement. So slavery is considered by the UN and other international groups as a crime against humanity. There's 9 items that the UN puts as being indications of atrocities or crimes against humanity in terms of scope and mass nature. For example, number 1, murder and extermination, enslavement, obviously, and forced labor. If you read these, all of these criteria fit what happened to African people. You know, I want to call your attention to number 7. It says inhuman acts, including medical experimentation. The father of American gynecology was this guy that I call the American Frankenstein, named J. Marion Sims. And the reason why gynecological research was so advanced in the United States was because Sims and other physicians had ready access to free bodies of black women who they experimented on. Harriet Washington details some of this in her book, Medical Apartheid. You should read that. So a definition of reparations, this is in COBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, the oldest group dealing specifically with reparations. They were founded in 1987. It's payment of a debt owed to atone for wrongdoings, to make amends, to make one whole again, the payment of damages, to repair a nation, compensation in money, land, or materials for damages. It is also, and most importantly, the admission by a nation that it has committed a crime against humanity towards a group. So keep that in mind as we go on. So these are some of the questions I get asked all the times when I'm making presentations about reparations. Here's one right here. But didn't Africans enslave other Africans? Shouldn't they pay reparations? This was less than 1%. And what I always tell people confuse the initiators with the collaborators and the victims, these 3 groups. So who were the initiators? It was the Europeans. People who ask this question act like somehow there wouldn't have been a transatlantic slave trade without the help of Africans. And that simply is not true. The Dutch, the French, Germans, English, Danish, and people are surprised at the Danish. He said Denmark asked the people on Virgin Islands, the Spanish, Portuguese, and Belgian. It started in 1441 and ended in 1888. In 1441, approximately 100 enslaved Africans were taken by the Portuguese and taken to the island of Madeira, where they were sold. And those were the first enslaved Africans. In 1888, of course, Brazil outlawed slavery after many, many years. And forms of slavery continued even after 1888. We'll talk about that in a minute. The collaborators in the transatlantic slave trade were less than 1%. If you want to say the only economy in West Africa where most Black folk come from in this country in the Western Hemisphere was probably Dahomey. I don't know if you saw the movie The Woman King, but part of that was portrayed in that film. This guy, Tipu Tip, lived in Zanzibar, and it's estimated that he, took Africans themselves. This is a collaborator, and sold them to Europeans. He also had enslaved Africans himself. But the idea that somehow all of West Africa was involved with the enslavement is just not true. It's interesting, I think, that people who are oppressed usually oppress their own kind. For example, you have Native Americans who scouted for Custer at the Little Bighorn. During World War II in Poland, they had these things called Judenrats, and they were Jewish people who sent other Jewish people to the gas chambers. We have in the Black community, we call them Uncle Tom, or in my book, Warrior Method, I call them super slaves. But we have people like Clarence Thomas, who I think is a super slave, who sits on the Supreme Court and, participates in the oppression of Black people. So those are the collaborators. And finally, the victims. Those are most Black people in this country, their ancestors. And they were stolen primarily from West Africa and sold in Europe, South America, the Caribbean, and North America. So those are the three groups that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. So reparations have a long history among American Africans. I love the story of Elizabeth Freeman Mumbet. And she sued for her freedom in 1781 in the state of Massachusetts. She was also the step-great-great-grandmother to a guy by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. When I taught at Fisk University, we called Du Bois the patron saint of the university. Her story is interesting. Her mistress was going to strike another servant with a heated shovel, and Mumbet blocked her and received a deep gash in her arm, which she refused to cover. She went to her attorney, a guy by the name of Theodore Sedgwick, in 1781. And it's interesting that Sedgwick is the fourth grandfather of actress Kyra Sedgwick. And I found out right before the program that he was also related to Kevin Bacon, which is also very interesting. Anyway, she sued for her freedom and received 30 shillings, which was equivalent today to roughly $550, which was a tremendous amount of money in 1781. So this is who I want to spend a little time on, Belinda Royall Sutton. Her story is just so fascinating. I had written the book or edited the book, Should America Pay, which is about reparations. And towards the end of it, I read about this woman named Belinda Royall. Well, it's a long story about her name itself, but Belinda the African. And she had put a petition together in 1781. I am sure that she heard, because they were both in Massachusetts, that she had heard about Elizabeth Freeman's case. We often think of contemporary Africans as not communicating with one another, but they actually did. So Belinda's story, she was born in Ghana in 1713. All of this is in her petition. She tells people, when she was born and also where she was born, on the banks of what she called the Rio de Volta, or the Volta, or now Volta River, in 1713. When she was about 11 or 12 years old, when she was actually captured by men whose faces she described were like the moon. They were Europeans. They marched through the Atlantic Ocean, and I say 250 miles away, and that's being generous, because at the if you can see, I don't know if you can see this right here, but on the southern part of the Volta River, there's a tributary that goes into the Atlantic Ocean. It's about 250 miles. If you take the entire Volta River, it's about 932 miles long. So but it's full of lakes and so forth. So the point is that she was marched, as many Africans were, out of the territory, the interior of Africa, to ships. And there were about 300 enslaved Africans who were kidnapped and placed on the same ship. Many people think that Belinda went directly to the United States, but she didn't. She went to an island in the Caribbean known today as Antigua. So when I always think this is interesting. So when she got to Antigua, she was purchased by a guy named Isaac Royall in Antigua, and she lived enslaved there from roughly the ages of 12 to she was 23 years old. In 1736, there was a slave rebellion in Antigua, and Royall said that he wanted to go back to New England simply because he liked the weather and so forth, if you read his diary. But in fact, I think he went back to New England, and specifically Medford, Massachusetts, because he was afraid that the rebellion was going to occur again, or another one would occur again. Plus, there had been hurricanes there, several fires that caused the loss of life, in addition to the rebellion that was there. He bought up 500 acres of land in Charlestown, Massachusetts, which is now known as Medford, right outside of Boston, and also juxtaposed with Tufts University to the so-called Ten Hills Plantation. And he became the largest slave owner in the state, and one of the largest enslavers on the coast of East Coast, including Brooklyn, which was one of the largest ports, by the way. Belinda, of course, went with him, and I don't like to even refer to it as a plantation. Again, Edward Baptiste said we should use the term slave labor camp, which is a more accurate description. The idea of a plantation is people sipping mint juleps and, singing Way Down Upon the Swanee River or something like that. But in fact, they were labor camps. A lot of people died on. I don't have time to go into that. So here's a picture or a painting of Isaac Royall Jr., his son. Isaac Royall, after he went back to Medford in 1737, died just a couple of years later. So his son inherited the property. I call him Junior. He had two children. I'm sorry. There's Royall's family, his wife, daughters, and 3 daughters. Very lovely family, if you ask me. Anyway, several people believe that Belinda's 3 children, which I just learned, I had thought there were 2 children by the name of Prine and so forth, but that was a son named Prince, and the other one's name was Joseph, and another one, we'll talk about that afterwards, okay? But anyway, many people believe that Isaac Royall Jr. actually impregnated Belinda, and that had been a deep resentment that she had towards him. So what happened to Isaac Royall Jr.? His wife died in 1770. In 1775, as the American Revolutionary War neared, the royal daughters left Massachusetts for England because they were loyal to England. He was a royalist. Royall fled Medford just 3 days before the Battle of Lexington, which was the first battle of the American Revolutionary War. And he went to Canada, specifically to Nova Scotia. Some of his descendants are still in Canada. I was up there a few years ago and located one of them. Didn't want to talk about any of this. Anyway, he failed to secure passage to Antigua. I don't know why he wanted to go to Antigua first, and I guess to England, where his family was, but he couldn't get a ship to Antigua. So he went to Nova Scotia, and he instructed a friend to sell the people he had enslaved in Medford to finance his exile in London. Belinda then sued Royall for 50 years of unpaid labor, and the Massachusetts Legislature awarded her about £15, 12 shillings, which in today's money is about $2,400. But she filed several petitions after this, and they did not, live up to their half of the bargain about paying her a pension for her time during enslavement. I'm now in the process of looking for her burial site, which I believe is someplace still in Massachusetts. So let's bring this up to date. Reparations are just as American as apple pie. For example, in 1971, $1 billion plus 4 million acres of land were given to the Alaska Native Land Settlement, the people you call Eskimos. In 1980, $81 million were for the Klamath of Oregon, another indigenous group. And in 85, $105 million for the Dakota of South Dakota. And of course, that very radical left-wing president by the name of Ronald Reagan gave $1.2 billion for Japanese Americans who were interred during World War II. So again, opponents to reparations say things like this: reparations are going to divide the races even further. Why can't we just leave the past alone? Can't we just all get along? I call this the Rodney King argument. Somebody needs to write a book entitled Answering Rodney. Was his question legitimate, and has it ever been answered? But I feel that we have always been divided as a nation on the issue of race, because we have not looked honestly and truthfully at the horrors of enslavement and its aftermath on all Americans. And we still see presidential candidates, even within the past week, making stereotypic remarks about Black people. And I won't tell you who that was, and I won't tell you what he said, but you can see it on the news almost every night, something dealing with race, even now during the presidential campaign. Other opponents say, but my family came to America after slavery on Ellis Island. We weren't even in the country when it practiced slavery. But you are now a citizen of the United States. And as a citizen of the United States, you have an obligation to pay for this nation's crimes against humanity. And other opponents say, but slavery happened a long time ago. Why should I pay for something that I never participated in, nor my family members? Believe it or not, I was not born during World War II. But in 1988, I had to pay part of my taxes to support, and rightly so, the $1.2 billion in reparations to the Japanese who were incarcerated during World War II, even though I had nothing to do with it, nor my ancestors. It's your obligation as a citizen of the United States. And I want to read this quote from Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. I didn't like the book, but that's a whole nother discussion. Anyway, she says this, which I think is true. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how all this started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures in the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with the house. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is, in fact, on our hands. So what can you do about reparations? I'm going to give three things. The first thing is to simply read. Americans know less about their history than any other group of people on this planet. Um, I've been to places in London and Paris where people know more about American history than we do. And that not only goes for white people and Latinos, but Black folk as well. We're in the middle or towards the end of Black History Month. And I'm still amazed at how many of my students in Morgan or people in general have never heard of people like Martin Delaney, have never heard of people like Belinda. So there's so many of us that still lack a history. And I recommend, these are 4 books, 2 of them which are self-serving because I did them, but read about Black American history. The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones is another very good book about American history. The second thing, ask all politicians running for office if they support reparations for the transatlantic trade of Africans. It's amazing how people have one issue items that they act as litmus tests for how they're going to vote. So some people say, do you support the Second Amendment? Do you support abortion? What are you going to do to save the whales? I think that Black people and white people ought to ask their politicians, do they support reparations for the transatlantic slave trade? And if they say no, or waffle on it by saying, well, I support affirmative action, that doesn't do it. Ask them point blank and demand an answer. And the third thing is understand the international dimensions of the reparations struggle. The struggle for reparation is not confined to the United States at all. It's global. And I've been as far away as Australia, and Black people there, known as the Aboriginal people, are discussing reparations in Canada, Caribbean, South America. I gave a lecture at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland a few years ago, just a couple of years ago. And I was surprised at the number of whites and Blacks united in trying to get reparations for those that the UK, enslaved, and their how they perpetrated slavery on Africans. So do all of that, and that would be my 3 points that you can contribute to understanding the transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to stop there now and see if there are any questions. How do I get out of this? Let's see.
To that.
How do I take myself out of this?
There you go. That's not something you would do. Mariana would have to do it for you. We do have a question. It says, do you have any examples of reparations being paid to Black Americans?
Yes, they're occurring right now in Evanston, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. I've worked with the people who are working to get reparations, but they are actually being paid right now for discrimination, the idea of redlining that took place in the 30s, 40s, and really actually even before then, when bankers literally drew a red line around Black neighborhoods and did not make loans or mortgages for these people. We have maps like that here in Baltimore. So they've set aside about $10 million in the city of Evanston, and reparations are currently being paid. And some of the people who are being paid, of course, are those who were discriminated against. And it's going for mortgages, new mortgages, as well as help with existing mortgages for those who were discriminated against. So the answer is yes.
Awesome. We just need a lot more of that. That's all. Now, when talking about reparations, can you give us a figure of what that reparations may? Because the controversy that sometimes come up when reparations is an issue for the Black community, is how would we know who to pay and how much would we give and all of that. To me, that's a stonewalling tactic of let's continue to talk about it but never do anything about it. So what do you think what do those numbers look like?
Well, there's various studies on this. One of the studies that I like was the one that was done in Ghana in the mid 90s. They counted a group of economists, sociologists counted up the entire aspect of enslavement. Millions of Africans stolen from the continent, uh, resources such as mahogany, oil, gold, diamonds, all of that, the cost of colonialism. And they came up with the highest number that I've seen, which was $77 trillion. Richard America, who's professor emeritus at Georgetown University, who I'm working with right now on a project, in fact, he estimates the cost at about 40 trillion. Robert Johnson, the former owner of Black Entertainment Television, said, just give all Black people, man, woman, child, all of them, $350,000. He was a Republican, and then wipe out affirmative action, and we're good. So these figures vary. Sandy Darity has an enormous figure also. The cost I was working with, what's the sister from St. Louis? She's a representative. Has the number of 18 trillion. So it's somewhere, in my estimate, somewhere between 18 to 30 trillion dollars.
And I still think that's not enough. Do you see any efforts or cases where we can say there is modern day slavery?
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand there were Africans enslaved in Mississippi as late as 1964.
1993.
You got one later than that. Okay.
1993. I used to visit families on plantations that were enslaved. Didn't find out until I was 18 because my mom kept telling me, asked me at 13, asked me at 18 why we had to always go visit them and they couldn't come visit us. And as a record, it's just now being taken off of the books as of February 19th, 2013.
Well, we need to definitely talk about that. About the Mississippi case, but I definitely want to hear about that. In Africa now, there are enslaved people in Mauritania. I've talked to them. I've talked to the descendants of people who were enslaved, the descendants of people who were enslaved in the Congo. You probably know that, what's the name of the book? King Leopold's Ghost is an excellent book to read about how Belgium, paid other Africans to slice off right hands to pay for it. But I can think of Mauritania right now. I can think of, outside of places like the Uyghurs in China. But nothing compares, and I want to make sure that people understand that, because I hear people say to me things like, well, the Irish family and what happened to that. Nothing compares to European chattel enslavement. Nations' economies were built on it. The wombs of Black women were commodified to produce children that would be sold. We have the history of people like Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, which many of you already know about. And so the idea of modern slavery, sure, it's in, Mauritania, it's in places like among the Uyghurs of, China, but nothing compares to European chattel slavery that lasted over 500 years. There's just simply no comparison to it.
Thank you. Andre also wants to know, can you revisit the list of atrocities that you shared were medical experimentation, which was executed upon Black Americans?
Well, I use Wiss's name Marion Sims as an example. I would recommend. There's like during the atomic era when they were testing hydrogen bombs. There's a video on YouTube called "A Hole in His Head." You may want to look at it. They expose Black people to radiation and literally burn holes in people's heads to see how much radiation could be. So there's another book out that I'm reminded of called Acres of Skin. Acres of Skin. And Maybelline, Max Factor, and all of these other products in the late 1940s and early 1950s, they would go into prisons and get Black people and put these chemicals to make their cosmetic products on the skin of Black prisoners as well as white prisoners, and mostly Black prisoners. And the reason why, the book is called Acres of Skin was because one of the you could say, I don't know if he was a co-founder, but he was an executive with Max Factor, walked into prison, and when he saw all of these Black people, he said, boy, this is acres of skin. So there's experimentation on Black people throughout American history. It's too numerous of things. And again, read Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. It's an excellent book that tells you. How could I forget the Tuskegee experiment? And where treatment for syphilis was withheld by from Black men who had contracted the disease. And it goes on, and she details all of it.
Tell the name of that book again. You just said Medical
Apartheid by Harriet. And here in Baltimore, what's her name? Henrietta Lacks.
Yes.
Her cells were taken from her. And here in Baltimore, several people are saying that she was killed in order to harvest her cells. And HeLa cells, which are the first two letters of her first and last name, are used throughout cancer research all over the world. And Johns Hopkins, which is like the elephant, 800-pound gorilla in this city as far as employment is concerned, has reaped billions of dollars from selling her cells. And she died in the early 1950s. Oprah Winfrey, believe it or not, did a movie about that.
Yeah, which the family was not happy about. But recently, in the past year, the family was finally awarded, although it's kept secret the amount, they were finally awarded a large sum for reparations. Yeah, finally, a half a century later. And I'm sure the money they received is still pennies in comparison to what these corporations have attained. Let's go back to the Royal House and slave quarters. When you talked about Belinda, so do we know which one of her children, or were all three of her children possibly by Royall Jr.?
We don't know that, but Belinda, she's still, the main document we have, of course, is the petition itself. You probably know that either Phyllis Wheatley or Primus, what's his name? Prince Hall's son or whatever, wrote the document for her, because I've actually seen that, the primary, the actual document in Worcester, Massachusetts, at the Antiquarian Society. And at the bottom of it, there's just a big X. But she dictated the petition, but we don't know who the men were in her life. And again, there were several people that I've interviewed about Belinda, and a lot of people in Medford say that it was Isaac Royall himself who impregnated her. We just don't know. We're not even sure if all three of her children came from the same father. We're not sure about that.
But what it does speak to is the unsafety of being a Black woman, because she was at their mercy. There was no repercussions. There was nothing to give her justice for what she went through. And therefore, when she petitioned to get her reparations, all the more reason why she should have been given it at the first and not having to go back and repeat the same thing for trying to get what was owed to her. Not that that would make it okay, but that was the atmosphere of the day, because women were expected to just push out babies like they were a factory.
Yeah, and if you look at, and you know this, Tammy, like, after, the United States outlawed bringing enslaved people to the United States in the early 1800s, that's when the rape of Black women occurred more rapidly, because they said, well, we can't bring women over here or steal, kidnap women from Africa. We'll impregnate them ourselves. And, I always say this, that, in almost every Black person in this country's lineage is a white rapist.
Yeah.
I know for a fact that my mother comes from she's from her ancestors are on the Anderson plantation, which was in Princeton, Kentucky. And my great-great-great-grandfather was a white guy that raped my great-great-grandmother. So is something that we don't like to talk about, but reparations, I think, will help Black people have a dialogue about those atrocities. And it will also, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, it will also have white Americans to be more honest about the history of this country.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think it's important to recognize and acknowledge that as well, because out of those rapings and out of the necessity to have workers, and I use that term lightly, workers, there were breeding farms. And
They
so,
were.
and a lot of times we don't even know that history about breeding farms and what that means and what that related to, and how that actually connects to our history today or to our present day, of people not being connected to their children, because it's generational stuff that hasn't been talked about, hasn't been broken. And so you have one person with multiple kids who don't have that attachment because it's been passed down. And so breeding farms were very intricate and very important to slave labor. But those are things that's not talked about or known.
And we're especially sensitive to that in Maryland, because the eastern shore of Maryland, where Harriet Tubman was born and where Frederick Douglass were born, is flat. It's right by the ocean, it's flat. And the reason why it was the number one breeding place in this country, that you see Black people call Anderson a lot, because the Andersons literally, they were like the Walmart breeding, and there's Anderson plantations all over this country, and many of them were right here in Maryland. So, and the reason why it became a breeding ground, the eastern shore of Maryland, was because it was flat. And if an African tried to escape from enslavement, like Harriet Tubman successfully did, they could catch them relatively easily.
It would be easier to do. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to bring up, have you ever been inside of the royal mansion, that mansion that the royals used, and there was a portrait of the family, and there's a young girl in that portrait? And I when I went on the tour, I said, well, who's the little Black girl in the picture? They did not know that that was a Black young lady in that picture. So I often wonder if that was Priscilla Sutton, because of the implications that were there. But when talking about those types of situations, they were like, well, how do you know she's Black? Because they're looking at her fair skin. And I was like, you have to look at her features. I was like, she has an African nose. She has an African forehead. You got to get past the tone of her skin. And that question kind of left, everybody was just like, wait, what do you mean? So I often think about other ways in which enslavement plays itself out in today's society, as well as back then, and how it led to the tentacle of colorism, and how that's also like a separation within the community. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I visited the plantation about 8 years ago, and there's a separate, what they call it, the kitchen, which is separate from the mansion. I was told that none of the furniture or accoutrements in the mansion itself, are like, genuine. They kind of put that in there. And I think that, the whole idea of colorism is something that is still prevalent among Black Americans today.
Mm-hmm.
We know of a sorority that I'll leave nameless that actually judge people what we call the so-called paper
bag. The paper bag test.
Right. So we all know that. But I mean, it is an issue, and it stems from enslavement. Malcolm talked about the house Negro and the field Negro, which was a little bit of an exaggeration on Malcolm's part. But because oftentimes the house Negro, who tended to be lighter skinned,
mm-hmm.
He or she had been raped.
Exactly. They were products of rape.
Right. They often poison,
mm-hmm.
The so-called master. They often killed the so-called master. So this idea that there was like some kind of separation. There's a good book. Malcolm? What's his name? The name of the book is what is it? I can't. It's about a slave rebellion that took place on a plantation in the late 1700s. And he teaches, what is the name of the book? He wrote a book about Bob Marley too, called, I'll think of his name in a minute.
Okay.
But anyway, it talks about this colorism, how the lighter skinned enslaved oftentimes, look down on the darker skinned person. But so I'm gonna tell you something, Tammy. John O. Franklin used to say the person who has been least analyzed on the plantation is the white woman. I mean, think about it. Her husband would go down to the slave plantation at night, rape Black women, and then come to bed with still the smell of sex on his body. Yep. And she saw those little light-skinned enslaved children running around. Those were her stepchildren.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband was the father of it. And so I think there's a brand new book. I'm citing these books that I'm forgetting. But
okay, you're putting the seeds out there. That's all that matters. They can figure it out.
Right. And I just thought the other book is called Marlon James, The Book of Night Women, which is an excellent book about colorism. But, the white woman, to this day, oftentimes, feels troubled by, this idea of that her man then, and to a lesser degree now, consorts with Black women. I've had sisters tell me a lot of times that, white women, in fact, there was an essay in Essence magazine a few years ago called The Toss. And this sister was telling me how when they go to the restroom, like at a play or a concert, how the white woman tosses her hair. The face of Black women. It's like these little anecdotal things. Somebody needs to write a book about white women on a plantation. There is one called she was a slaveholder or something like that.
It's called They Were Her Property. That's one. They were her property. And it goes into great detail. And again, it speaks to the unsafe situations that Black women were in, because on one hand she's being raped by the male enslaver, and then she's being abused by his wife because the wife is feeling threatened over a situation that she has no control over. So she has no control over this man doing this to her.
Not at all. And the only visual portrayal I've ever seen was the film 12 Years a Slave, where the white woman was clearly jealous of her husband's favorite mistress. mistress. And I
Yep.
don't even like to call those women
They
mistress.
weren't mistress because that indicates they had an option. That there was no option. So that's another romanticizing. Like you said about the word plantation. I was having this conversation with someone. They were like, no, plantation revs up ugly things. I said, but yeah, it's still romanticizing because it's the antebellum house. It's the, like you said, mint juleps and drinking tea.
Right,
And it's like it's a forced work labor camp or a slave camp. But so I compromised and said both. All right, how about we say the plantation was the forced work labor camp of inhumane conditions
right,
that our ancestors had to deal with. We
right.
have a couple of more questions. Mariana would like to know, can you speak on the success of reparations in other countries?
Oh yeah, among the in New Zealand, the Maori have lobbied successfully for reparations. Um, France, France, Macron has apologized for enslavement, but I always feel that, apologies for slavery without reparations are
Exactly.
hollow. Uh,
Exactly.
you see in places like, the most obvious and the most widespread reparations that were ever given were the Jewish people because of the Holocaust.
Yep.
That occurred, of course, in Germany. But we also, even though we had nothing to do with the Holocaust,
Exactly.
we have monuments. There's a major monument. Some of you may have visited the Holocaust Museum on
Yeah, yeah.
the wall there. Uh,
But
there's a
don't forget the reparation of money that was given to the Jews by the United States during Barack Obama's administration. They
exact
received millions of dollars for that, for something that didn't even happen here.
here
And
in
yet the reparations can't be given to those whose blood, sweat, and tears built this country. So it's success other places, but it's still got yet to be success here.
yeah. And another example is Japan has paid
Yes.
reparations to Korea for their rape of what they call the comfort women.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of examples of reparations around the world. It's not something, because it's a crime against humanity. But
Mm-hmm.
there's some groups that are still struggling for it, like the Armenian genocide by Turkey. Turkey still has not admitted they committed that
Yeah.
genocide. So there's a lot of people still struggling for reparations that deserve them.
Yeah. Here's one other question from John Mills. Do you see reparations as strictly monetary payments to individuals, or do you see it inclusive of efforts to correct how the history of slavery is interrogated and presented?
Uh, you know, say the first part of that again.
Do you see reparations as strictly monetary payments to individuals?
No, not at all. That in my trips to the Caribbean, Sir Hilary Beckles says that several Rastafari, if you look at Bob Marley's new movie or the movie about Bob Marley, I've had Rastafari say to me, "Look, Doc, give me $100,000 and a one-way ticket to Africa, and I'm good." You It consists of issues about land and should America pay. I have a chapter in there called "And the Earth Moved," about how much land was stolen from Black people. We have actually met with Native people over the issue of land
Mhm.
because Black folk own land, but the original owners, and I don't even like to use the term owners, but
Yeah.
the original
Inhabitants, occupants. Yeah.
exactly. So it can take the form of land. It can take the form like Brown University up your way in Rhode Island,
Mm-hmm.
that they have given scholarships to Black folk. Georgetown University here not here, but down the road in D.C., they are trying to put together still a package for the Georgetown 272, the people who were sold to keep to keep Georgetown afloat. Also, the Catholic Church has donated, because it was is a Jesuit institution, $100 million as a set aside for the descendants of the 272. I have a little problems with that because they're make them as loans and grants, and I was
Yeah.
asked to participate. I had problems with that. So there's a lot of forms of reparation: land, money,
Mhm.
repatriation, tax break, for black. I mean, what if they said black folk wouldn't have to pay taxes in this country for the next 30 years or 40 years? And I mean, no tax, sales tax, uh, you know, uh, real estate tax, uh, income tax, none whatsoever. That could be a form of reparation.
Now, there is the study that said it would take approximately 237 years for the Black community to catch up with the wealth gap.
Right.
Now, Yale has just recently apologized. Did you hear about their apology about slavery?
Yes.
Because of what about the enslaved people who helped build Yale. So I think that that apology is all well and good. But what do you think the next step should be? Because, like you said, an apology with no works or actions behind it is quite hollow.
Well, Tammy, if I come to your house and break all the windows and all the windows, so the cold air comes in, you get colds,
Hmm.
and then I did it. You know that I did it. And I come by and say to you, Tammy, I'm sorry that I broke the windows out of your house. And you say, okay, that's fine. What else are you going to do? You want your windows repaired. So
Exactly.
let's go down to Home Depot or wherever and buy some glass that you pay for and buy.
Hmm.
That's what reparations are. I mean, it literally means to repair.
Yeah.
And the idea that somehow this nation has committed these crimes against humanity with native people, have paid them reparations, and rightly so, and the Japanese, and paid them reparations, and rightly so, but not paid its greatest crime against humanity, which was enslavement. I mean, it's something to be examined. Ta-Nehisi in his book says, until America deals with the issue of reparations for enslavement, it will never be really America or live up to those documents
Hmm.
that were first struck years ago.
No, I agree. Oh, Professor, this comes by so fast. This is a great conversation. I appreciate you coming in and stopping by at Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. This is a great conversation. I wanted to continue, and as you know, protocols, we weren't meeting in person. Our very first one is going to happen this June, so maybe next year we
Okay,
can have you come to Connecticut in person
I'd be
and
happy to.
do this conversation in person. Thank you so very much. Don't leave us behind scenes. Wait for me to come back there. But
Okay.
thank you so very much again. And thank you everyone for tuning in today to watch Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I am Tammy Denise. Until the next time.